Need to turn this on. No, I'm not. I'm looking back there. I'm looking into the sound room because my mic wasn't on. I was seeing if they were turning it on. No, this is you. This is there. You can't tell from there. But, yeah. He's just feeling guilty. That's probably it. No, we're just having some technical difficulties today. Not only was the mic not on, but my little clicker here is being unreliable. It wasn't working. I think I've got it working now, although it was still kind of intermittent. But if it goes out and stops working, that's okay. We don't actually absolutely have to have that. We'll survive without it. But now I am looking at you. It is time to get started today. We're in Job chapter 31, and we're right in the middle of this Avowal of Innocence, as we called it last week, where, if you remember, here, we'll see if this works, since it was working a second ago. How far down do I have to go down the aisle to get it to work? There we go. Just remember the overall structure of the book. I think this is good to help us keep the big picture shape of it in mind. We all know everything that happens to Job. All these bad calamities befall him, and then it just comes gushing out of him in that curse lament where he says, I wish I'd never been born. And that's what prompts his friends to speak to him. And there's that dialogue that makes up so much of the book, and we all know the basic outline of that, where the friends hit repeatedly on this doctrine of retribution. That's what their worldview is steeped in, the idea that the righteous are blessed without exception, the wicked suffer, they're punished without exception. They see Job suffering so greatly, therefore the only logical conclusion, man, Job must be a really bad guy. He must be a great sinner. That escalates throughout the dialogue, where at first they're advancing that somewhat cautiously. By the end, they're accusing him of specific heinous crimes. Job, meanwhile, increasingly realizes he's not going to get any sort of answers from his friends because he's struggling to figure out why this is happening to him, because he knows that doesn't match his experience. He's not a great sinner, so he can't make sense of his suffering. His friends have nothing to offer him, and so he increasingly turns toward God, seeking a resolution. And a couple of weeks ago we looked at that hymn to wisdom, chapter 28, right there in the middle of the book, which points us to the fact that is really the theme. It comes out of the beginning, comes out of the end of the book, and that's really what Job is being tested about. Is he going to continue to trust God? And so this idea of seeking a resolution with God and God alone is consistent with that theme. And that's what we see in these three chapters, his avowal of innocence, which, again, we began looking at last week. This is this final step, a daring step that he takes in this effort to clear himself. And we saw those first two parts last week that really set that up. Chapter 29, where he's reminiscing about the good old days, looking back at the way his life was before all of this happened to him. And then chapter 30 is the contrast. But now, it begins in verse number 1. He's lost everything. He's lost his wealth, he's lost his health, he's lost his family, and where before he was so respected in the community, now he's a laughingstock, an outcast. Even these youths that he would have completely disdained, this worthless rabble, they look down on Job. And that's what sets the stage for the oath of innocence in chapter 31 that we're going to look at today, which is really the focal point of these three chapters of this avowal in totality. We've seen that depth of his affliction, of his suffering. Now he's going to demand relief against that background. He's seen increasingly that God is the only place he can find answers. Well, here in this chapter, he's going to rest his case there. He wants a legal judgment from God. And we mentioned this somewhat last week, but this whole chapter, this concept of taking an oath of innocence, draws on legal customs from the ancient Near East, where if You were being accused by someone of something, and it got out there in public to the point that you were suffering economically, you were suffering socially, but they were really just spreading these tales about you. They hadn't actually taken you to court. You could take them to court and demand some sort of resolution. That is, they needed to show themselves, make these charges formally against you, demand that they put their case out there. They show the evidence that they have. And in doing so, that defendant might swear an oath, just like Job does here, in an effort to prove that they were guiltless. It's placing yourself in God's hands. It's designed to force the hand of the accuser for one thing, but also when you're invoking an oath with all these curses, it's designed to place yourself in God's hands. It's a desperate move, a last gasp to try to clear yourself of any sort of wrongdoing, because the idea is if you're swearing an oath backed up by these curses, God either has to activate those curses or else effectively you're cleared of any wrongdoing. Because what Job really wants here is for God to speak, give him some sort of direct answer, but even if God does nothing, if these curses he invokes aren't activated, well, that's at least sort of an answer by default in itself, because God hasn't done any of these things to him. A common formula that you'd find in an oath of innocence, and we're probably familiar with this sort of formula in general, would be something like, may the Lord do such and such to me if I do this, or if I do not do this. Usually when you took an oath like that, the one who was swearing it would suppress that actual curse. That is, they'd use some sort of euphemism, or they'd use an abbreviated formula, because you're almost afraid to even say the words about what might happen to you. In ancient Near Eastern culture, words were considered to be extremely powerful in a way that I don't think we really quite understand today. But words were taken very seriously, whether they were spoken or whether they were written. And calling down a curse was considered to be an extremely grave thing and an extremely daring thing for someone to do. But Job is bold. I mentioned you would normally just sort of imply the curses and not state them. 4 times throughout this chapter, we're going to see he specifically calls down the curse that should befall him. Verse 8, verse 10, verse 22, verse 40, just as that first example. Verse 8, let me sow and another eat. Let what grows for me be rooted out. And of course, we'll read through all these in a moment. But I think his bravery that he demonstrates there, maybe even his recklessness, if you want to have a less charitable view of it, all that demonstrates his confidence. This is a guy who is certain that he's going to be vindicated by God. It's not confidence in himself. It's confidence in God. And so he's daring enough to call out these curses specifically. And this sort of oath, it's similar to some that we've found in other parts of the ancient world. It's similar to one, for instance, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, with someone being weighed in the balances when they enter into the afterlife, even though the sins that are mentioned here are going to be different. We also have a parallel in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 12 through 15, where you have to confess that you've adhered to the law, not just some of these serious things, but really some subtle sins, some attitudinal sins, some sins of the spirit that others might see. You have to confess to those that you're not guilty of them before you can go and worship. But what we're going to see ultimately throughout this chapter, it consists of Job enumerating this long list of sins that he swears he has never committed. And you might be tempted to sort of try to find some sort of order to these, but we actually don't find any sort of order like this anywhere else in the Old Testament. Some of them are things that the friends have accused him of specifically, but not all of them are. So I think the best answer for this is it's whatever pops into his head, whatever crime, whatever sin he can think of in the moment, he's confessing to the fact that he's not guilty of that. I think that sort of uneven flow here, and the fact that some of them don't even all quite fit together, may be symptomatic of just how bold a step this is, and some of the qualms that he has about being brazen like this. But what we'll see too is, instead of just denying that he's committed some of these blatant acts that could be punishable by law, he actually in some cases gets behind them. He talks about his attitude. He talks about his motivations. He's at pains to demonstrate that he's kept right relationships with other people throughout this. And so when you think of, now Job is a patriarch. He lived before the time of the law of Moses. He's not a Jew, as you know, evidently. As far as we know, he's not even part of the family lineage there. He's from another land. But when we think of the law of Moses, we think first and foremost of the Ten Commandments. And you might think, well, he's just going to go through those. But he only names off 2 of the 10 commandments. But he asserts things like he's never abused his servants, he's never abused the poor or the weak, he's never hated his enemy. He zealously asserts the fact that he's been devoted to God. And I think what's interesting is a lot of the ways that he phrases this, in getting behind these overt acts, to the thoughts and the motives. It sort of points us to some of the things we see in the Sermon on the Mount, especially those of you who've been going through that on Wednesday nights with us. Job holds himself accountable for his thoughts and for his motives. So this is a high standard that he's placing on himself here. And then the oath concludes by him putting his signature on it, really, verses 35 through 37. He demands that God, who is his accuser in this scenario, right? That's the idea, this legal judgment. He views God as the accuser, the one who's disrupted his life, the one who's causing him harm, and so he wants God to appear. He demands that God, as his accuser, give him a written document that he can place there on his shoulder for everybody to see it. Everyone will know that he's innocent. But what's interesting, again, about this is Job's convinced that God has to be just. That's what is so fascinating about this book and about the resolution it points us toward when we're suffering, when we're having struggles in our lives, is that on the one hand, Job is crying out to God. He thinks God is oppressing him. He thinks God's responsible for his pain. But on the other hand, at the same time, he doesn't turn away from God. He's reaching out toward God in the midst of that pain. And he believes, he's fully convinced that God is going to act justly and he's going to vindicate him. So if he didn't have that belief, it wouldn't do any good for him to swear this oath. That confidence that he has is the basis of this move that he makes here. Job is desperate to hear from God and to be back in that right relationship with him. So I think in a lot of ways this oath is something of a concession to his friends. They've accused him of these specific crimes, including, again, as we said, many of the ones here, though not all of them. But Job is fully convinced that God is going to prove them wrong. He's going to vindicate him. So these sins that are denied here, we'll read through this, of course, and it's straightforward in the sense that it all makes sense. How many sins you see in this chapter just depends on how you want to group them all together. You know, you can smash some of them together as different ways of saying the same thing, or you can expand them out. I've seen anything from 7 to 16 sins counted in here, depending on how you look at it. We're going to view it in terms of 11 different sins. Lust in verses 1 through 4. Falsehood in verses 5 through 8. Adultery in verses 9 through 12. Mistreatment of servants, verses 13 through 15. Oppressing those who were vulnerable, verses 16 through 23, and that's where we find some that others separate out because we are talking here about concern for the poor, clothing the poor, perverting justice against those who are weak. Materialism in verses 24 and 25. Paganism, verses 26 through 28. And again, we have some that all are placed together, even though they don't exactly fit to our way of thinking necessarily. But satisfaction at your enemy's misfortune in verses 29 and 30. Failure to be hospitable to strangers in verses 31 and 32. Concealing your sin, having secret sin without confessing it, verses 33 and 34. And then finally, abusing the land in verses 38 through 40. But let's get into these. Let's see how far. Again, I have to walk down here. Hey, there we go. All right. Well, now I went too far testing this out. Okay. So we're going to go through these in order. The first one, lust, verses 1 through 4, Job 31. I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? What would be my portion from God above and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Is not calamity for the unrighteous and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does not he see my ways and number all my steps? So he begins with this affirmation. He's controlled his eyes to keep them from lusting. And you probably would be aware of this, that in the Old Testament, the eyes are often spoken of as the gateway to the heart, how you let sin in. If you remember all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, when the serpent tempts Eve to eat the fruit that's forbidden from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what does she see? She saw that it was a delight to the eyes. So it goes all the way back to that, this idea that the eyes are this gateway to sin potentially. And Job says, I've made a covenant with them. I've controlled them. I haven't looked to lust. And then we have this series of 3 questions, verses 2 through 4 there, where he considers how God would treat him if he had gazed improperly. God has fixed a portion, a heritage to a person according to their deeds there in verse number 2. In other words, he knows God will know. God knows what he does, and he knows that God will hold him accountable for his deeds. And I think, too, this is a reminder that before all of this befell Job, he thought about the world just the way that his friends did, right? This doctrine of retribution. He thought the way that they did it, if somebody sinned, they were going to be punished right there then immediately by God. That's sort of the background here. He knew God would see, and God would punish him for that according to his thinking. He ponders the consequences of pursuing iniquity there in verse number 3. That is disaster, calamity. That's what happens to those who sin, and obviously Job wants to avoid that. And so he'd snuffed out even any desire to sin. God knows exactly whether he's let his eyes wander or not. Verse number 4. So, in other words, right here at the outset, we may wonder, why is this one placed first? And as I said, I don't think there's any particular rhyme or reason to that. But you do have here in these rhetorical questions, you have right here the basic conviction that Job has underlying this oath. God knows the why. God knows the why of Job's suffering. God knows that he is innocent. And the hope is that because God knows all this, he's going to be moved by Job's oath here to act justly towards him. The second one then, verses 5 through 8, falsehood. If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot has hastened to deceit. And it's worth noting, that's the formula we're going to find throughout most of these. If I've done this, then may this happen to me, these if-then statements. If I've walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way and my heart has gone after my eyes, and if any spot has stuck to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. So Job says he has avoided falsehood in all aspects of his life, and if anybody doubts that, if anybody suspects that, he asks metaphorically that God would weigh him, like you weigh something, grain in the balance, in the scales, as proof of that. And we're familiar with that imagery of scales. The scales often represent God's justice in wisdom literature in the Old Testament. We still use that imagery today, right? We talk about the scales of justice, so that's common. And I think here too, in this context of falsehood, he's swearing he has been false, that's a fitting image to use, because one of the ways, you see this again in wisdom literature, one of the ways people were false is they cheat others with their scales. Their scales wouldn't measure properly. And of course, we have that imagery too, right? You talk about putting your thumb on the scales so that you don't get an accurate measurement. Same idea here. So Job says he wants to be measured by God's scales. Everybody will know that he's not false. He's never turned aside from that way that God has set before him. In verse 7, you notice again, he's saying that his heart hasn't gone after his eyes. So there's that idea again of your eyes controlling your heart. And he says his mind hasn't been controlled by his lust, by those things he might want, by what his eyes sees. It hasn't gotten to his heart. And his hands are spotless. In other words, his whole body has been brought under control. And this is where we have for the first time. I mentioned 4 times he's going to call down these specific curses. This is the first one here in verse number 8. If he's lying, may another person feast on his crops while he starves. Or may his crops be uprooted, which would just demoralize him after all that labor that he's put in. And I think, again, this is one of those things that the consequence is fitting with what you've been accused of doing, right? Effectively, he's claiming that fortune that he made, he hasn't done it falsely. He hasn't done it by coveting what other people have, by looking at it. He hasn't done it by dishonest business dealings. But the idea here is reaping what you sow. If I have done that, if I've cheated in any way, cheated other people in order to make my fortune, then let it all be taken away from me. Let me starve. Take my crops. It's a fitting punishment. But he says he hasn't done that. The next one then, adultery, verses 9 through 12. If my heart has been enticed toward a woman, and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down on her. For that would be a heinous crime. That would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For that would be a fire that consumes as far as Abaddon, and it would burn to the root all my increase. Job disavows any sort of lust that he's had, any sort of stealthy scheme that he might have put in place to try to seduce his friend's wife, and this is sort of the companion to that first one. Earlier he says he's never taken advantage of a virgin. Now he says he's never been seduced, enticed by anyone's woman, anyone's wife. This is spoken of as such a heinous crime because the violation of taking your neighbor's wife, for one thing, it was considered treacherous in the ancient world. This is different from our view, but in the ancient world, this would have been viewed as a form of theft. You're taking something that belongs to someone else. And then, of course, there is also the sin against his own wife, that he's breaking the covenant that they've made here. And for the second time, then, he specifies a curse. Verse number 10, let my wife grind for another, let others bow down on her. Part of this is his wife being a servant or a slave for someone else. Let her be reduced to this sort of menial labor. Let her belong to another. Grinding his grain, that's what the NIV, for instance, fills in there. But this could also be a euphemism. It could have a double meaning. That is, it's not only talking about grinding the grain, but it has a sexual connotation. That's at least a possibility. The second one, let others bow down on her, absolutely carries a sexual connotation. It's a euphemism here, but the NIV there, I think, even says, let her sleep with other men, spelling it out for us there. But the whole idea is, let her just be ordered about as her new master pleases, doing menial labor, being humiliated, having to serve him even in this way. That's a strange curse for a modern audience, because we think, well, that's not happening to him as much as it's happening to her. And while that's no doubt true, In the ancient Near East, this would have been a curse for him too, because he would have been humiliated. He would have been publicly disgraced by all of this openly happening to his own wife. But that's because this is so repugnant. You have that terrible nature of adultery expressed in verses 11 and verse 12 there. It's a heinous crime. It's one that was punishable even by the civil law, and he likens it to a fire burning out of control, even down to Abaddon. That's another name for Sheol, the abode of the dead. It consumes all a person's wealth. It consumes their whole household, destroys it. And that's why it's so dangerous. And Job says, if I'm guilty of this, then let my wife belong to someone else. But again, the idea is he hasn't. He's swearing that he's never done anything like that. The next one then is mistreating his servants, verses 13 through 15. If I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? So Job contends that he's treated his servants fairly and kindly. He's listened to their complaints. He's accepted that as his God-given duty. And I think what's really interesting here, he says that he's done that not only because he knows he would have to give an account to God if he'd mistreated them in any way, but he bases that on the fact that God created all of them, and so God is naturally going to be concerned about all of them. What God has created should be treated with respect, which I think is a really interesting statement for him to make in a culture that would normalize not only holding slaves but abusing them even. This idea that he views all people as being created by God. And that's the basis of the fact that he treated them all well. Then we come to these statements about the poor and the weak. Job swears that he hasn't oppressed them in any way, verses 16 through 23. And as I said earlier, there are a few different things under this. You could divide this up into smaller chunks, because he talks about how he hasn't oppressed anyone who is poor. He talks about how he's clothed the poor, how he hasn't perverted justice. But I think really these are all rooted in the same thing, this fundamental idea of oppressing those who are vulnerable, who are powerless, those people who can't help themselves. If I've withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it. For from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I've seen anyone perish for the lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless because I saw my help in the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. So Job defends the way that he's treated the poor, even though he was this man in a high position, even though he was wealthy and influential. The poor, the widow, the orphan, he's treated them all well. When they begged for food, when they begged for shelter, Job responded to those cries. He didn't even eat his own bread without making sure that they were fed first. He had concern for them. And he inserts this little parentheses in verse 18 about how long he's been concerned. That this isn't something he just started doing lately. As long as he can remember, from his youth, from even the womb, he says. He's spent a lifetime caring for people who were in these horrible, destitute conditions. Specifically then, he says he showed compassion to those who were languishing from a lack of clothing, verses 19 and 20. Now, this is one of those things that he absolutely was accused specifically of doing. Back in chapter 22, verse 6, Eliphaz says that he had stripped the naked of their clothing. But not only is that false, Job says, no, he hasn't done that. In fact, he's actually clothed those people who needed it. He defends his conduct then as a member of the assembly at the gate there in verse number 21. Not only has he been concerned about meeting those physical needs of people, there when he was overseeing the court as this most respected elder, he hasn't abused his power in any way just because he could. He hasn't lorded it over anybody. He's been just. And he specifies the punishment then if he's lying. This curse he calls down, let his shoulder be separated, let his arm be broken. And the whole idea there, this is again where the curse relates to what he's swearing, he'd be powerless. He would be helpless. If he couldn't use his arms, he'd be just as vulnerable as these would be. So if he's ever not taken care of those who are needy, if he's ever oppressed those who are vulnerable, let him become himself just as vulnerable as they are. And he states the reason for being so compassionate, verse number 23, he fears God. He fears disaster from God would come upon him if not for that. Now, that's not that he's in terror of God. That's that sense of fear that we see commonly in the wisdom literature, right? That idea of fearing God and keeping his commandment, respect, reverence, awe. He's someone that wants to serve God. Then we come verses 24 through 28, materialism and paganism. And if your Bible's like mine in the ESV, this is all one paragraph, and that's why we've lumped them together here. And in fact, we have them both here with the if statements. And we might wonder why, what does one of these have to do with the other? Wouldn't seem better to separate these two out. And I think, especially the way he speaks of them here, I think that these two sins linked together indicate that seriousness of materialism. And in fact, something that we see sometimes today, maybe it's even effectively making wealth, making gold your God, your pursuit of that. You value that above all else, and you worship it, that almighty dollar, or whatever it would have been in his day. You worship that just like you would God. And so these two things are linked together. If I have made gold my trust, or called fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much, if I've looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon moving in splendor, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, this also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I would have been false to God above. So Job claims that despite all that wealth he had, he's never placed his confidence in gold, verses 24 and 25. He hasn't, even when he had all that, he hasn't gloated about it. He hasn't viewed himself as the one who made all of his fortune. And then verses 26 and 27, not only has he not put his confidence in gold, he's never had his affections drawn to the sun or to the moon, so that he bowed down to those. And you probably know that in the ancient world, the sun and the moon were commonly worshipped as gods. But Job says he's never done that. He's never wavered, never even secretly thrown a kiss. That's a pagan gesture of worship, of praise of those bodies. Never done that, not even in secret. And he says if he had that sort of idolatry, whether it's worshiping his wealth or worshiping these false gods, the sun and the moon, that would be punishable because it would deny God. It would be worshiping the creation rather than the creator. Then we get to this lengthy section here. If my clicker works again, yeah. Verses 29 through 34, we really have three different things that it's kind of hard to link together, but we have these three conditional clauses of things that he disavows, verse 29 down through verse 34. This is a difficult section in the sense that there's no curse here to link them the way that we've seen before. So the if is continued here just so we see that he's still taking an oath. Also, the subjects don't seem to be linked because we've called it here meanness and secret sin. But what he says, first of all, is he hasn't rejoiced at the enemy's misfortune. He hasn't then been inhospitable to strangers. And then finally, he's confessed sin. He's not harboring anything secretly in his heart. If I've rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me, or exulted when evil overtook him, I have not let my mouth sin by asking for his life with a curse. If the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? The sojourner is not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. If I have concealed my transgressions as others do by hiding my iniquity in my heart, because I stood in great fear of the multitude and the contempt of families terrified me so that I kept silence and did not go out of doors. So, pretty straightforward, at least in what he's saying, and if we can't see exactly how they're all linked in his mind, Job says that he hasn't rejoiced at the ruin of his enemy. He not only showed he not only loved his neighbor, but he actually reaches beyond that in showing compassion to those who are his foes. He hasn't spoken harm against them in any way. He hasn't asked for their death. He entertained strangers, yes, generously. They were greeted warmly. They never left hungry. Job's door was always open to travelers. And then he sums that all up, that he hasn't concealed any sort of sin without a confession. He's never covered up any transgression that he's committed. He confessed his mistakes. He takes responsibility. He didn't fear public opinion. He didn't fear that his family might ostracize him. None of those things swayed him because he'd never transgressed God's law in such a way that he had need to fear. Now he breaks off then with sealing the oath, but I want us to go down here a little bit out of order just briefly and go to the final sin in verses 38 through 40. Abuse of the land. If my land has cried out against me and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment and made its owners breathe their last, let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. So this is the last injustice that he talks about, abusing here the land or those who work on the land. You could probably look at the law of Moses, if you remember this, just how seriously they take that sort of care and provision that you're supposed to make for the land. Same idea underlying this. And again, the curse is in keeping with this sin. If I've violated this, then may my fields be left unattended, robbed of all their fertility. Now, in between here, we have verses 35 through 37 where he seals the oath. And we skip that because that really almost seems like the climax, and it is in a lot of ways. At least it points us to the significance of all of this. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. So Job has sworn he is guiltless of committing any sin, particularly these 11 that we've run through here in this chapter. So this seems like it should come last, right? Why is there one last sin and curse after this in verses 38 through 40? A lot of modern interpreters feel like this is misplaced, and so they'll stick it earlier and move verse 38 up to after verse 34, for instance, just swap those last two things there. I'm inclined to think that that's just using modern logic on a text in trying to rearrange it here. I think this is probably just another example of Job using an afterthought, which is something that if you read through this whole book, he has a penchant for. If you're to go back to chapter 3, you'll see in that curse lament, he seems like he reaches a climax, and then he has an anticlimax where he says something after. Same thing happens in chapter 14, and we'd read those if we had more time, but go read through some of these other speeches. I think the whole thing here is that this is realistic. It demonstrates his disordered state of mind. He's gone through all of these, and he swears that he hasn't committed any of them, and here's my signature. I think, oh yeah, here's another thing I haven't done. It's just something that comes to his mind at the last minute that people might be in doubt about. But it's a reminder that he's disordered here. He is under a great deal of strain in taking this oath. But he ends all of this oath, with this exclamation, pleading for a hearing with the heavenly judge there in verse 35. Oh, that I had one to hear me. That hear there, that word in Hebrew, that's a technical term for hearing a legal case. He's asking for a judge here to arbitrate all of this. And he says he's fixed his signature on the oath. He's made all of this official. God has to now either activate those curses, all those things he's called down, his shoulder blade falling out, losing his fields here, losing his wife. God either has to activate those, or the idea then else he has to write out this document, this writ, that will demonstrate to the whole world that he is innocent. And Job says he'd carry that on his shoulder. It would be in full display for everybody to see, testifying to the world that he is blameless, that he is upright. In other words, what he wants is to be vindicated publicly. In a world where everyone thinks if you're suffering greatly, you must be a great sinner, and Job says, no, I'm not. He wants everyone to know that he's not, that the way they've thought about him is wrong. What I think is interesting, we should note this, he doesn't seek restoration of his wealth. You notice that? He doesn't ask for all this to be undone. He doesn't ask for his fortunes to be reversed. He doesn't ask that God would go back to blessing him the way that he did in the old days. He just wants back in that right relationship with God. And he wants that to be visible to everybody else. And Job says that if he had that, then he could approach the court confidently. He would speak everything to the very end here. He remains tenacious. And at the conclusion, the one part we didn't read, the very end of verse 40, you notice it says, the words of Job are ended. He rests his case here. He's not even going to lament anymore. The only time we're going to hear from him are a couple of brief responses to those questions that God asks when he comes down and he challenges him. But the whole point is, Job now is waiting for God to act. This book has been all about building up to that, realizing that the only resolution he can find is with God, and now he's rested his case with God. So I think when we see this whole speech in its entirety, chapter 29 through chapter 31, this really helps us to understand the book and the direction that it's taking. When we think about the shape of the whole story here in 29, recounting his former honor, chapter 30, mourning his humiliation, chapter 31, then swearing this oath of innocence, a confidence that he has that's so strong that he's able to enumerate these specific sins that he says he's never done under the threat of these terrible curses if he's lying. And if you think about this, if I can go back far enough here to the outline, if you think about this compared back to chapter 3, where he is in such deep pain that he lashes out with that cursed lament, wishing that he'd never been born, or if he had been, that he had been stillborn. This here demonstrates this progression that we've seen. The fact that he's risen above that deep despair that we saw back in chapter 3. And it's not that his pain is lessened. It's the fact that he's been able now to give form to his thoughts. He's been able to give form to his frustration here by addressing God directly. Remember, he's kept a high view of God throughout all this. He knows God's the only place he can find resolution. But for us, I know the bell just rang and we're out of time, but here's the point for us to keep in mind for our own suffering. Job has suffered in every aspect imaginable. We talked about this somewhat last week. Physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually. And yet, in the midst of all that, he's maintained his faith in God. Since God is the one in control, God's supreme, Job knows he has nowhere else to turn. And so, if we wonder about that patience of Job, that patient Job where the prologue is faded away and we've seen him all disordered, chaotic throughout these speeches, well, what we see emerging is the perseverant Job, the long-suffering Job, the one who continues to trust in God in spite of all appearances. And what that demonstrates is that God's opinion of Job is pretty well founded. That basic motivation for serving God, it's not because he's been blessed. It's because he longs with a relationship with God for its own sake. And that's what we should long for, too. I know we're out of time. If you have any questions or comments, then we can take it afterwards, after we're out of here. Next week, we'll look at Elihu's speeches, sort of interrupting the flow of thought here. Thanks for your attention this morning.